long-standing. This doctoral research on trees in Tolkien's most prominent works has continuously been expanded and revised and has not reached a final form in print yet. These findings are being turned into a monograph that will hopefully see the light of day next year. And today's lecture will summarize all the key facts. So in order to summarize such a large number of findings in an orderly manner, I have divided the study into a set of conventional subsections. Therefore, I will begin presenting a short general introduction, the state-of-the-art, research gap, and research questions, and the justification of corpus and use of key terms. I will proceed with the biographical evidence that reflects Tolkien's attitudes towards trees, and this will be followed by a description of the theoretical framework employed and the applicability of ecocritical methodology to Tolkien's literature. The highlights of each subsection of the analysis of the trees, copses, woods, and forests in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings will be presented next. I will wrap up the talk by introducing the most relevant conclusions drawn from the study. I promise that the lecture is not so dull as it seems by looking at the outline, or at least I hope so. Right, so instead of employing random images from the internet or soulless AI-generated content to illustrate my slides, I have chosen a set of personal pictures which complement well the content of the talk and show evidence of my enthusiasm for trees, and also show how horrible photographer I am. This is obviously not Old Man Willow, but a specimen at University Parks, one of the numerous trees that can be found in Oxford, as you shall see. But first of all, it is necessary to clarify what do I mean by the word tree. For this, Judd and Judd's definition seems most appropriate. A tall, woody plant with usually a single main trunk. This differentiates trees from bushes, which have more than one trunk or stem and are overall smaller. I will not get into a sticky debate about measurements and the characteristics of certain genera, as these are thorny issues, pun intended. But jokes aside, though trees are important for our well-being for several reasons, both scientific and spiritual, they have lost all magnificence, and they are only regarded for their usefulness in economic terms. However, Tolkien attempts to recover our appreciation of trees through his fiction. Trees are also beings that portray best the evolution of his ecological perspective. Thus, it is important to study Tolkien's literary trees because they help us understand Tolkien's conservationist ideas and fiction better. Their study also demonstrates that Tolkien anticipated the current environmental debate about the preservation of forest mass. Ultimately, an analysis of his literary trees helps us recover their long-lost exceptionality, which can have a positive impact on the preservation of real-world trees. So for this picture is one of the few that I didn't take in the UK. This is a forest close to my home, and I've chosen it for the wonderful atmosphere it evokes and the wonderful nature that these beings can create whenever they're grouped together. So I wanted the literature review to be as wide-ranging as possible, and therefore I divided the available research into three categories to cover all the available scholarship on the matter. The works in the first, general scholarship on nature in Tolkien's works, discusses all the elements of the landscape, such as water, earth, rocks, the sky, etc., which includes trees, of course. The second, scholarship on plants in Tolkien's works, takes into consideration scholarship which analyzes solely the flora. And the third, scholarship on trees and forests in Tolkien's works, as its title indicates, includes exclusively a scholarship on trees and forests. This painstaking literature review allowed me to identify clearly the research gap, which is the most prominent forests and individual trees have been in the spotlight, while lesser-known wooded areas and trees remain unanalyzed. And this is also the case of the evolution of trees that the evolution that trees undergo from The Hobbit to The Lord of the Rings. I intend to fill this lacuna by providing a detailed chronological progression of the representation of trees and forests from The Hobbit to The Lord of the Rings, in the light of Tolkien's evolving ecological stance. This draws us to the following research question. How does the portrayal of all trees and forests from The Hobbit to The Lord of the Rings help us understand the evolution of Tolkien's environmental views over time? That's the question I'll try to answer. So regarding the corpus, the published versions of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings have been selected because they represent the author's final thoughts, at least in most cases. Tolkien's other works and literary translations have been taken into consideration when discussing issues peripheral to the main discussion. And The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings are placed at the center because these are, first, his best-known works, the great importance trees and wooded areas have in both, and owing to the fact that Tolkien's ecological perspective changed most from the writing of The Hobbit until the publication of The Lord of the Rings. And now it's time to focus on some of the key terms employed in the analysis. So symbolism has remained a highly controversial issue in Tolkien scholarship, as you may know. Tolkien contradicted himself often by asserting there is no symbolism in The Lord of the Rings at times and claiming the opposite on other occasions. This inconsistency is explained by Tolkien's dislike of certain symbolic interpretations of his works, which does not, of course, invalidate the study of Tolkien's literary symbolism. The term role refers to both plot value and economy. Plot value aims to describe whether trees and wooded areas are ornaments, key settings for the action, recreational spaces, places for communal rituals, etc. The study of economy intends to provide answers to several queries. Are the trees or the bark, seeds, fruit, roots, etc. used in any way? If they are not, is their wood employed for some other purpose? The goal of studying the symbolism, plot value, and economic uses of trees through the lens of eco-criticism is to define the importance Tolkien bestows on trees and forests and his attitudes towards them. So this is quite a privileged view of part of Oxford, and this picture was taken from New College Tower. So the reason why I included this in the presentation is because whenever we're walking through the streets of Oxford, we may not notice how many trees and how woody Oxford is, something that Tolkien must have been quite aware of. So whenever we think about faraway places that might have influenced his fiction, we also have to think about places closer to home, which is where he spent most of his life. So before presenting the theoretical framework and methodology, it is necessary to summarize in brief Tolkien's extra-literary interest in trees and forest. And this will also help to apply eco-critical theory to his works, as eco-criticism bridges the literary realm and the physical world. So since childhood, Tolkien showed a strong connection with trees and wooded areas, as a plethora of biographical records demonstrate. However, if there is one quotation which illustrates his love for trees best, it is the following famous excerpt from a letter. I am obviously much in love with all plants and above all trees, and always have been, and I find human maltreatment of them as hard to bear as some find ill treatment of animals. This takes us to a famous aphorism that summarizes in a nutshell his keen environmental awareness, especially regarding trees. Every tree has its enemy, few have an advocate. So biographical information further proves that many real-world trees and wooded areas were somehow incorporated into his stories. His life worries influenced and shaped his fiction in this regard, and he tried to reconcile his mind and find a solution to his problems through artistic invention. For those of you unfamiliar with eco-criticism, I will now provide you with some foundational principles of this theoretical framework employed for the analysis of Tolkien's trees. In order to define eco-criticism, I have chosen a couple of definitions from two established scholars. Cheryl Gladfelter writes that eco-criticism is the study of the relationships between literature and the physical environment. And Scott Slovic expands on Gladfelter's definition by adding the study of explicit environmental texts by way of any scholarly approach, or conversely, the scrutiny of ecological implications and human nature relationships in any text, even texts that seem at first glance oblivious of the non-human world. So though some eco-critics argue that eco-criticism lacks fundamental principles, my analysis is based on 12 tenets suggested by Susan Jeffers, with additions from other scholars. So 1, eco-criticism discusses the non-human. 2, it attempts to understand nature. 3, it requires the use of post-human language. 4, it questions anthropocentrism as well as our assumptions about the natural world. 5, It seeks to reconcile the human-environment dualism while always acknowledging its presence. 6, it reconsiders the terms human, natural, and self. 7, it debunks hierarchies, giving the same status to all the constituents of a given habitat. 8, it assumes that nature is both a crafted concept and a reality. 9, eco-criticism acknowledges the existence of otherness. 10, it answers an unresolved issue, trying to bridge our understanding with ecological reality. 11, it considers the interconnectedness of the elements of the world. And finally, 12, eco-criticism aims to develop ethics that complement science in the quest for solutions. So the most important of these principles is the last from the list, that eco-criticism complements politics and science in the quest for solutions to environmental problems by investigating the cultural causes that led to those disasters and by convincing skeptics. So ultimately, eco-criticism offers post-human language which helps one discuss nature with a progressive stance. 3 words will be used in the analysis to help in this task, and those are ecocide, which means the destruction of entire habitats, anthropocentrism, the belief that humans are superior to all other life forms, and ecocentrism, the global interconnection between all constituents of our planet. Right, so why eco-criticism? So Tolkien was an early environmentalist, as his writings show, and it doesn't matter that he preceded the movement by some years. Also, his literature is well suited for eco-critical analysis owing to his radical views on the environment. So in order to execute the analysis, I will employ 2 different approaches to eco-criticism, namely environmentalism and deep ecology. Although environmentalism and deep ecology are said to clash head-on, Tolkien does not exclusively fit within any of the categories. This is because his literary creations blend principles from both strands. With regard to the former, Tolkien suffered from what the environmental philosopher Glenn Albrecht refers to as solastalgia, which is the pain or sickness caused by the loss or lack of solace and the sense of isolation connected to the present state of one's home and territory. Deforestation and even the felling of individual trees were causes of deep grief for Tolkien. This is mostly absent in The Hobbit, yet we see it clearly in The Lord of the Rings, where the enemy's ubiquitous tree cutting leads to numerous characters embodying the author's feeling of solastalgia, epitomized and addressed during the Ents' assault on Isengard or the Scouring of the Shire, for example. Tolkien's way of thinking is in agreement with Ursula Hayes' definition of the environmentalist core viewpoint, which is to criticize modern ideology for the belief that the world can be understood scientifically so as to, by means of technology, shape it and then profit from its resources. This is a key issue that Tolkien addresses at length, particularly concerning the results of industrialization and mass deforestation. Tolkien may also be labeled a deep ecologist owing to certain beliefs that stem from his faith. According to Andrea Dennekamp, Tolkien's Christian environmental stewardship ethic acknowledges the validity of wilderness to exist according to its own laws. But what is deep ecology exactly? Lawrence Cook defines this as a radical form of ecology which challenges anthropocentrism and which insists that human beings must subordinate their interests to those of the planet. Certainly, Tolkien's ecocentric slant draws him closer to the ideology of deep eco-criticism. This stance, not yet overt when Tolkien wrote The Hobbit, was later made explicit in The Lord of the Rings and continued to develop throughout his life. Although Tolkien's focus is humanist, it is essential for the success of the free peoples that they acknowledge the centrality of otherness and protect the natural world. However, if nature broadly understood is so ubiquitous in Tolkien's works, why limit the scope to trees alone? This is because the narrative engine and its intricacies can be unraveled and understood through the analysis of the predominant and indispensable trees in Tolkien's fiction. That is why a combination of eco-criticism, tree symbolism, and tree uses may constitute the foundations for a true understanding, not only of Tolkien's trees and forests, but his works. The analysis that will be presented next also draws on Tolkien's biography, his intentions as a writer, and the historical and cultural legacy he inherited, and reader responses. At any rate, the revised versions of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings remain the main focus. So this section analyzes the evolution of Tolkien's ecological perspective, looking at his portrayal of trees, copses, woods, and forests from The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings through the lens of eco-criticism. Subsection 4.1 explores the copses, woods, and forests in The Hobbit, which serve to lay the foundations for the comparative analysis. Subsection 4.2 follows suit, exploring the same elements in The Lord of the Rings, place an emphasis on the development of their representation over time, including the introduction of individual trees, as there are no individual trees of importance in The Hobbit. Now, in case you might be wondering what the handout is, now please look at the handout for greater details. The object of analysis are not organized in alphabetical order because, unfortunately, many forests, woods, copses, and individual trees do not bear a name. Since all need to be studied for a comprehensive analysis, a solution is required to classify them in an appropriate manner. Thus, each instance is organized into 4 different categories according to their size and density in descending order. So forests are A's, woods are B's, copses and wooded places are C's, and individual trees of importance are D's. Group D only includes individual trees of importance which are not part of forests, woods, or copses. Together with one of these letters, A to D, a digit rank in ascending order starting at 1 is assigned to each instance to generate an alphanumeric code, as you can see. For example, have a look at Mirkwood on the top right corner, A3. The order of the reference is determined by the very first appearance in the narrative of The Hobbit and later in The Lord of the Rings. In other words, the first textual manifestation is considered in favor of intra-story chronology, starting with The Hobbit and then moving on to The Lord of the Rings. Although the order in section 4 is mostly determined by the first textual manifestation, the subsections of the analysis are divided according to a different set of rules. In The Hobbit, the Misty Mountains constitute the geographical boundary separating eastern copses, woods, and forests from western ones. The only exception is Woods B1, which is first evoked in the west, is the one around the Lonely Mountain, and therefore analyzed accordingly, even though it is geographically situated in the east. Since geography of The Lord of the Rings makes a satisfactory organization impossible, the individual trees, copses, woods, and forests are classified in accordance with the 4 stages of the Hobbit protagonist's journey. First until the arrival of Rivendell, then until the breaking of the Fellowship, then until the defeat of Sauron, and finally on the journey back to the Shire. Right, so since I do not have enough time to discuss every single example, today's lecture will only cover the most representative samples in brief. So in this part, A1, B1, C1 to C3 are analyzed, and though trees play minor parts, they remain relevant. The Hobbit contains some sort of reflection and lament for the current state of the land in B1, pine woods around Dale and the Lonely Mountain, in contrast with the past, and hints at the budding solastalgia that will not develop into a conscious ecological response until The Lord of the Rings. There is implicit lament, and the narrative conveys a sense of grief for the devastated landscape, which heightens the dwarves and the men of Dale's loss of property, status, and society. Thus, it is not coincidental that the reversal of the ecological destruction is coetaneous with the recovery of the livelihood and future prosperity of the free peoples in the region. We can observe in the copse of willows in C1 on the banks of the Holwell River that trees further contribute to define the moods of a given scene. In A1, Trollshaws, there is the first manifestation of danger and the possibility of death, but there is lack of biological details. C2, Rivendell, is different, which is descriptions of the valley's trees, though lacking the almost scientific precision in The Lord of the Rings. However, even minor copses, such as C3, copse at the western foot of the Misty Mountains, are shown to be important because they contribute to the overall well-building effect. Though trees play minor parts, they remain relevant. So now this is not Hobbit, this is my younger self. And this picture was taken close to a forest which is close to Aldershot. When Tolkien was part of the officer training corps, he camped close to these woods. I'm not going to speculate whether if this had any influence over his fiction, but I've selected this picture because of the otherworldly atmosphere that trees can create, especially when forests are unmanaged, such as this yew forest in Aldershot. So now it is the turn for A2, A3, B2 to B4, C4 to C6. So trees in B2, climbing pine woods east of the Goblin Gate, offer protection, and in A2, forest east of the Goblin Gate offers the contrary, though the travelers meet some valuable allies that rescue them. No overt environmental views are conveyed in A2, yet this may be explained by Tolkien's knowledge of pines benefiting from fire for vigorous regrowth. C4, lines of trees that are west of Bone's house, uncover some relevant economic information. And in B3, the oak wood in which Bone's house is located, Bone represents an early example of ecocentric perspective that will eventually come to characterize Tolkien's writings. The cohabitation model proposed by Tolkien in the oak woods in which Beorn lives and elsewhere in Middle-earth is one of anthron stewardship, where the dweller tends to and protects the environment, but also transforms and tames the territory. However, it seems that at this point, Tolkien had not yet developed, or at least was not intending to reflect, his elaborate attitudes towards nature present in his later writings. No matter how much of a fairy tale forest A3 Mirkwood is, its ecology is more carefully constructed than it meets the eye, which is in a way unsurprising given Tolkien's interest in science, botany, and gardening. The proto-elves in The Hobbit may not be as refined or developed as their Lord of the Rings counterparts, but they already possess the trait that defines their race. They're landscape managers, not wilderness advocates. Mirkwood also helps Bilbo to evolve, ultimately. The utilitarian concerns for the well-being of B4, woods on the shores of the long lake of Esgaroth, cannot yet be labeled ecocentric, but constitute the first step in the realization and acknowledgement of the importance of trees for the habitability of a given area. This awareness, as anticipated above, will evolve into the much less anthropocentric perspective that pervades the Lord of the Rings. So in contrast to the Lord of the Rings, individual trees do not constitute a separate category in The Hobbit, as I said before. As Nana mentioned, trees remain collective, less defined and developed in The Hobbit compared to the ones in the Lord of the Rings. And only 10 species are mentioned, those being beech, birch, elm, fir, hazel, larch, oak, pine, willow, and yew. In the Lord of the Rings, the total amounts to a staggering 37, those being alder, apple, ash, bay, beech, birch, box, cedar, cherry, chestnut, cypress, elm, filbert, fir, hawthorn or thorn, hazel, holly, holm oak, juniper, larch, leatherthorn, linden, magnolia, malon, myrtle, oak, olive, pine, plum, poplar, rowan, tamarisk, terebinth, silver birch, sloe, willow, and yew. Right, so it is now the time to turn to the Lord of the Rings. So in this subsection, I analyze A1, A4, B5 to B6, C1 to C2, C7 to C16, and finally D1, which means that certain wooded areas are revisited in this section. So we learn through C7, for example, the copse of leaning alders around the bridge at the water in Hobbiton, that Tolkien valued trees for their own sake. However, he was not blind to their central role in the low technology societies he was writing about, or to the relevance trees had in the making of his world-building economically consistent. So an important aspect developed in A4, the Old Forest, is the characteristic agency of trees that distinguishes most the Lord of the Rings from The Hobbit, when analyzed from an eco-critical perspective. A drastic turn towards ecocentrism shifts this pattern, and during the Hobbit's journey through the old forest, trees react in numerous ways to the intruder's behavior by diverting paths, dropping branches, and stooping down. In A4, Tolkien's ecological perspective had noticeably evolved, but it is still a long way from reaching the superior ecocentric perspective he adopts later on when he introduces the ants and the horns to the reader. So this is another picture of a yew tree in older shots in order to show how this unmanaged forests evoke this otherworldly atmosphere, which is a kind of a nice counterpoint to the first forest I showed to you, the one which is closer to home. So moving on, the next subsection discusses A5, B7 to B8, C17 to 24, and D2 to D3. So clusters of trees will remain the chief and preferred concealment from the enemies for the Fellowship of the Ring, and the most comforting too. The natural world is by this point mostly represented by trees, which are gaining more relevance and centrality as the narrative moves on. In contrast with the Hobbits, the trees in the Lord of the Rings are more often associated with real species and therefore closer to those in the real world, providing further proof of the author's growing ecological sensibility. The ecological sensitivity Gandalf shows when he indicates that setting C19 ablaze was the only way out, though not the least painful. C19 is the small hill with the knot of all untwisted trees, southwest of the pass of Caradhras, by the way. Gandalf's words make discernible the author's own environmental views, imbued as they are with the feelings Tolkien experienced in the real world when he witnessed the destruction of trees. The author could not highlight the existence of any trees other than Merlin, because it would make A5 Lothlorien more worldly, which is also why he had to conceal their and the other trees' exploitation in this forest. Sam's gift from Galadriel anticipates that the final turnaround in the Lord of the Ring is not only victory over Sauron, but the restoration of trees that will heal the scars from the Long War. Trees in this subsection have, as innumerable times before, helped save the principal quest from failure. It seems as if in Hobbit and in the Lord of the Rings until the breaking of the Fellowship, Tolkien had not yet completely made up his mind about the wanton destruction of trees. So now it is time to discuss A6, B9 to B17, C25 to C34, and D4. So to a greater extent than in The Hobbit, Tolkien's wooded areas and trees are often related to the background history and major events in the Lord of the Rings narrative, revealing how Tolkien's growing environmental sensitivity towards these woody plants was growing. By means of successful storytelling, Tolkien helps us understand these biotic others in the form of Ents and support their cause for protecting trees. The Entwives are gone, and it is unlikely they will reunite with the Ents. Though Treebeard's elucidation symbolizes there is yet hope for the Ents' ecocentric stewardship to continue protecting wooded areas in Middle-earth. A6 Fangorn completes the transition from Tolkien's informed natural awareness in The Hobbit to a narrative in The Lord of the Rings of explicit, evolved ecological views becoming a central part of the tale. This partly explains Tolkien's statement in one of his letters that The Lord of the Rings is so largely concerned with them, referring to these woody plants, which proves, together with the analysis of the trees and wooded areas in subsection 4.2, that there has been a great leap forward in the ecocentric perspective Tolkien adopts in The Lord of the Rings as compared with The Hobbit. B10, the mobile wood of wands and the accompanying Ents, can be interpreted as the epitome of Tolkien's biocentrism in The Lord of the Rings, which distinguished it from The Hobbit. Yet it also comes to show that Tolkien was fully aware of what unchecked nature can imply. While the free peoples use their skills or power to protect, heal, or stimulate the growth of trees, Sauron aims at the opposite, and wooded areas that fall under his shadow, such as C28, copses at the end of the cleft of the outer southern edge of the Emerald epitomize the consequences of his behavior, as we shall see. The worldliness of Mordor may in part stem from the horrors readers witness within, but it is its dull, stunted, and scarce vegetation, such as C33, low scrubby trees in a dry riverbed at the western foot of the Morgai mountain ridge, and especially the near absence of Tolkien's beloved trees that make it the most undesirable location in the Lord of the Rings for the free peoples, and of course for the nature-loving Hobbit protagonists. During the course of the war against Sauron, the free peoples come to understand that the most precious jewels of the lands are the trees that clad them, such as those in Gondor, Rohan, Eriador, and the Elven realms. Sauron's disregard for these spaces is in line with his environmentally noxious policies, though it proves in the end to be his great undoing, which says much about Tolkien's environmental views. Aragorn's decision to forsake and let the Ents manage C26, ravaged copses in Wizard Vale, and C27, the Tree Garth of Orthanc, and let the wild men manage B17, the Grey Wood, and his preoccupation with replacing D2, the White Tree, differentiates him from previous rulers because his choices guarantee a future without unchecked deforestation, and because he ensures that the trees are revered and cared for as long as he governs. Sauron has been defeated, and his spoliation of nature may be undone, but it will take influential rulers with the right attitudes towards the environment if plants, and especially trees, are to recover their lost ground and thrive in the Fourth Age. So in order to illustrate this slide, I've chosen a picture of a tree that I planted when I began my doctoral research. So it was quite symbolic of how my work was developing, from a tiny seed into a hale specimen. Trees, I think, can always inspire humans for the incredible properties, for the vigorous growth, and also for their extreme resilience. They're extremely resilient to any kind of adverse conditions, such as it happened to this tree, but that was my dad's fault, mostly. So the last subsection only revisits A3, Mirkwood, explores B18, and C35 and 36, and goes back to D1. So as the end of the Lord of the Ring draws near, Tolkien's perspective becomes more ecocentric than ever, though the environmental model he proposes leans heavily towards environmental interventionism, as demonstrated by A3, Mirkwood. In The Lord of the Rings, trees, both individual and collective, become fully developed in their details, relevance to the plot, symbolism, and roles, as compared to The Hobbit. Thus, the new mill symbolizes the ecocide of C36, former avenue of trees along Hobbiton Road, and it stands in direct opposition with the trees. This is why the protagonists, who have become more environmentally conscientious during the quest of the ring, cannot accept it. The planting of trees in C36 also symbolically conveys how the process of industrialization is reversed by the hobbits, perhaps fulfilling Tolkien's Kaiamir. Such healing takes longer in the real world, but by showing its outcome without delay, Tolkien helps the reader visualize the benefits of tending the land and its trees, with the hope that some may follow suit with their descendants in mind. So the new D1, the party tree, is the living proof of the four Hobbit travelers' long journey, but it is also an astonishing sight of wonder that may induce visiting pilgrims to speak marvels of the trees of the Shire, and perhaps even motivate them to try to clothe their lands with these woody plants. The regeneration symbolized by D1 and the wooded areas of this last subsection, together with the ecocentric message they convey to the readership, I would mark the greatest leap in Tolkien's environmental views from The Hobbit to The Lord of the Rings. They provide a clear insight into the now more mature ecological perspective of the writer. So it is my hope that the members of the audience, after being patient enough to endure this plodding and exhaustive analysis, are now convinced that there is indeed a clear evolution in Tolkien's ecological perspective from The Hobbit to The Lord of the Rings, best conveyed by his literary trees, copses, woods, and forests. Trees and wooded areas are not only more numerous, detailed, and important in the Lord of the Rings as compared to The Hobbit, their plot value, symbolic significance, and economic importance are greatly enhanced as well. This statement by no means implies that trees and wooded areas are irrelevant in The Hobbit. In fact, some of the defining features of trees in The Lord of the Rings can be traced back to The Hobbit, which contains many examples that point to its author's awakening environmental conscience. The Hobbit's trees already portray instances of great biological accuracy, implicit concerns for deforestation, and they impact the story on various levels through powerful symbolism, narrative relevance, and economic use. Although Tolkien relies in some measure on The Hobbit's world building for the creation of his trees and wooded areas in The Lord of the Rings, there is plenty of room for innovation. In this later work, the sentiency of trees rises, as does the ecocentric and environmental messages they convey. Through his unbiased portrayal of trees, Tolkien recovers not only their spiritual value, but also reminds the reader of the biological importance of these and other plants have for the stability of ecosystems and ultimately our own world. No wonder then that The Lord of the Rings ends with the tree's regeneration, either by natural means or aided by the free peoples. So for Tolkien, every tree has its enemy, but he has convinced us all that all of them deserve at least an advocate. Thank you so much.